Good morning, good afternoon and evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this discussion on tackling sexual exploitation and abuse online. My name is Emma Bartha and I'm a journalist at the Thomson Reuters Foundation, where I cover women's rights issues. It's my pleasure to moderate this panel, and I'll shortly be introducing a fantastic panel of experts. But first, a couple of words of introduction. As we all know, increasing digital connectivity, access to smartphones, webcams, other tech has fueled an explosion of online harms. Girls and women across all societies are increasing risk, and we've sadly seen this really amplified during the COVID-19 pandemic, where we've all spent far more of our lives online than we'd probably wish. These new harms include, of course, live streaming of sexual abuse, online trafficking, online sexual coercion and extortion, image-based sexual abuse, and many others. Today's discussion follows a report that was published by Thomson Reuters Foundation, I should say Equality Now and Thomson Reuters Foundation, in November, looking at the key challenges to addressing and ending these online harms of sexual exploitation and abuse. It examined legislation across several countries and found that laws, both international and national, had simply not kept pace with technology. One major obstacle, of course, is that there may be, in pursuing these cases, is that, of course, there may be multiple perpetrators, multiple victims, multiple platforms, all across different countries with different laws. Our panel will be discussing this, and they'll also be looking at the experience of survivors and examining the challenges that arise from the tensions between the need to preserve online freedom of expression, but also obviously protect people from online harms that we're seeing proliferating. I'd like to begin by asking Amanda Manyami, Equality Now's digital law and rights consultant, to present the report's main findings and recommendations. After that, I will invite our speakers to give their thoughts on the presentation and the recommendations before moving to a general discussion. There will be time for a Q&A at the end, and I'd ask you to post your questions, please, in the Q&A function rather than the chat function. We may miss questions if they're posted there. And please do make sure and specify if your question is directed to a particular panelist. Finally, I should add that this is being recorded and will be posted online, and you will all receive an email with a link afterwards and any resources that are mentioned during the discussion. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Amanda Manyami, who is an expert on the legal risks and harms associated with technological innovation. Amanda, can you please kick us off?
Thank you very much, Emma. In November 2021, Equality Now, with the design and publication support from Thomson Reuters Foundation and Practical Law, published a report titled Ending Online Sexual Exploitation and Abuse of Women and Girls, a Call for International Standards. It is that report that forms the basis of today's event. In the report, we examined laws relating to online sexual exploitation and abuse, or Asea for short, at international level, EU regional level, and in Kenya, India, Nigeria, the UK, and the US. The report provides comprehensive analysis of laws and policies related to Asea, alongside in-depth discussions with survivors, activists, and lawyers working with survivors of Asea. In our research, we found that Asea encompasses a number of sexually exploitative and harmful behaviors that occur online or are facilitated using digital technologies. Although it can impact anyone, women, adolescent girls, and children are disproportionately affected because it occurs as part of the continuum of gender-based violence. Women are 27 times more likely to be harassed online than men. Perpetrators take advantage of the sex, gender, and structural discrimination inherent in our patriarchal society and the economic inequality faced by women, children, and other vulnerable groups for sexual gratification and often profit. So what are the different forms of Asea? Our list is not exhaustive, but we found that Asea includes online grooming, live streaming of sexual abuse, child sexual abuse material, online sexual coercion and extortion, online sex trafficking, and image-based sexual abuse. These forms are interconnected and usually do not occur in isolation of each other. You may have noticed that we used different terminology to refer to some of the forms of Asea. This is because words matter, because they affect how we conceptualize issues, and they inform and shape our responses to the issues and actions to which they refer. It is important to use appropriate words when referring to online sexual exploitation and abuse. For instance, at Equality Now, we use the term online sexual coercion and extortion instead of sextortion. Instead of revenge porn, we use the term image-based sexual abuse. Through conversations with survivors and experts, we found that the impact of online sexual exploitation and abuse is the same as violence perpetrated in the physical space. Victim survivors experience psychological trauma, isolation and withdrawal from public life, and stigmatization within their communities. These impacts are exacerbated by failure to access justice through the legal system. Our research found that there are several challenges faced when people seek legal recourse and redress after experiencing sexual exploitation and abuse online. We found that there's no single internationally binding instrument that specifically defines and addresses Asea. This is reflected at regional and national level. The lack of consistent laws pertaining to Asea makes obtaining legal recourse extremely challenging. We also found that there are tensions between digital rights, such as the right to freedom of expression and privacy online, and the right to protection from online sexual exploitation and abuse. Another finding was that the regulation of digital service providers and platforms is inconsistent and uneven across different countries, and often these regulations do not do enough to protect users against online sexual exploitation and abuse. The analysis in the report affirms that online sexual exploitation and abuse is a multi-jurisdictional and multifaceted problem, which requires a global, gendered, harmonized, and coordinated response from the international community. We therefore need an international instrument in the long term. However, in the immediate term, we recommend utilizing opportunities presented by existing conventions such as CEDAW. There is need to ensure as well the responsibility and accountability of digital service providers and platforms so as to ensure user safety from online sexual harms. Ending online sexual exploitation and abuse will require multiple stakeholders working together to find solutions. Thank you for joining us today as we discuss these possible solutions and opportunities.
Thank you very much, Amanda, for laying the ground so well for our discussion. I would like now to introduce our expert speakers. So starting with Dr. Debarati Halder. She is the founder of the Center for Cyber Victim Counseling in India, and she's an expert in cyber law and a professor at Parel Institute of Law. Paige Morrow is legal advisor to the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Opinion and Expression. She is an expert on freedom of expression online and in the media, including issues such as misinformation and hate speech. Heather Fisher is Senior Advisor for Human Rights Crimes at Thomson Reuters Special Services. She is former White House Special Advisor to End Human Trafficking and leads Thomson Reuters' strategy to protect human rights and combat crimes of exploitation. Faith Kasiva is Secretary for Gender Affairs in the Kenyan government. So I would like to start with Dr. Debarati Halder and ask her if she could share her thoughts on the findings and recommendations. And I would just ask that each panelist please keep their responses to a couple of minutes because we have a lot of ground to cover. Thank you very much. Debarati.
Thank you, Emma. If you ask me about the survivors' experience during the pandemic time, what we have seen in India is that our classes went online, and most of us, I mean, all of us were basically homebound. During that time, I have seen that women, especially in the education sector, women who are housewives, that is homemakers, etc., adult women specifically, have been targeted by cyber crime or cyber perpetrators. And therefore, there had been lots of image violations. There had been different kinds of criminal activities that had happened. Unfortunately, even though we have laws in India towards protection of women from sexual exploitation, on the cyberspace also, these women, some of them definitely did report, but some of them could not actually go ahead for reporting because they felt that the blame would be again taking back towards that. Why did they at all use the social media profiles, or why did they expose themselves before the cyber perpetrators? There had been many cases that had been lodged. That means the police has registered the cases. Unfortunately, this may not have survived towards the trial of the cases in the courts, mainly because the women probably have withdrawn from such cases, and also because the police could not provide proper support which they wanted. But coming to the question of how the survivors had felt, yes, there had been extreme steps also. Yes, there had been several issues. Say, for example, the last and the very recent thing that we are getting to see, which is very well being known as Bullibai case. All such cases, there not only one individual but groups of women have also been victimized. And also we have seen that gender-based, not only gender-based, but also community-based violation of women, on the cyberspace, that have also been taking place. Further, I would also like to mention it here that even though the laws are there, as I just mentioned, there had been cases reported where the police had basically stated that they're not able to handle such cases because they are not able to find out where the actual root cause is. That means they were not able to find out who the perpetrator was, because even though the websites are there and some of the offices of the websites are there in India, we have got Information Technology Act, IT Act, rules, intermediary rules that came up in 2021, which also made the intermediaries more liable. But unfortunately, I have not seen many cases where victims could have been happier.
Debarati, thank you very much for that. We will be coming on to police and survivor stories a little bit later. Are there any comments, very, very quick comments you want to make on the findings of the report before I move on to Paige?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Paige, could you give us your thoughts on the report, please, and its recommendations and findings?
Thanks so much, both to you for moderating the session and to Equality Now for publishing its important report. I think what it does an excellent job of is mapping out the current sort of context for the challenges, and it highlights as well, particularly on that chart that we show that looked at the different types of abuse, the challenge of the varying forms of content that we're dealing with, and how for each of those different types of content, it's necessary to look at exactly what would be an appropriate response for it. As the representative for the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Opinion and Expression, we're within the UN system. So of course, what we're able to do is to promote better interlinkages between the existing mechanisms at the UN level and within regional and national mechanisms that may already be in place. I think what Equality Now's report does as well is highlight the need for better cooperation, better data gathering as well, because accessing reliable data on the problem is often a serious challenge. And then finally, I mean, one issue as well that we have is in terms of when they're looking at appropriate responses. I mean, Debarati just highlighted it as well in her intervention. The issue of, I mean, for example, when there's content that's posted and reshared, distinguishing between primary and secondary perpetrators becomes quite complex. And so just at a very practical level, meeting the requisite burden of proof within the national criminal justice system can be quite challenging. And this is an area where ongoing cooperation and sharing of best practice could be quite useful. Happy to go into it further later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paige. That was really interesting. Heather, can you share your thoughts on the report? Thank you.
Sure. First of all, thank you for including me in this important discussion. It's really a pleasure to share the virtual stage with the other panelists represented here today. And I'm very proud that the Thomson Reuters Foundation supported this report in partnership with Equality Now. Safeguarding women and girls from online exploitation, as you know, is perhaps more important now than ever before. Those of us who have committed our vocation to human rights work know that the risks for online sexual exploitation are stunning. Over the past 15 years, reports of child sexual abuse material to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, or NCMEC, has skyrocketed by 15,000%. Unfortunately, last year, over 17 million reports to NCMEC's cyber tip line included nearly 70 million reports of child sexual abuse material files, a staggering amount. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the situation significantly. Because of the pandemic, children are digitally learning now and have more access to devices than ever before. So that puts them at an increased risk to be lured and groomed by predators online. And also children are viewing graphic sexual content at younger and younger ages. Unfortunately, a lot of our data does address child sexual exploitation. As Paige mentioned, we have a lot of holes in our data, but if you take a look as a comparison between pre-pandemic reports and reports made to NCMEC during the outbreak, they saw a 106% increase in cyber tips. NCMEC also reported that 4.2 million reports of online child exploitation in April of 2020, and that's up 2 million from March of 2020. And while the statistics and figures are staggering, we really shouldn't be paralyzed by such an overwhelming issue. There are tangible solutions, I think, that each sector can act on to safeguard women and girls from online exploitation. I'm really looking forward to sharing additional recommendations for a way forward later in the program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heather. Those statistics are just horrifying. Should focus minds, hopefully. Faith, can you give your thoughts on the findings and recommendations, please?
Very much. I think from the onset, really allow me to congratulate Equality Now and the contribution of all those who made this report possible, including survivors' reports, whose accounts have been featured in this report, the pro bono law firms that provided the support. As it has been alluded to, Kenya is one of the featured countries in the report, alongside Nigeria, as two leaders in the region with high intake uptake. Obviously, we are featured with countries like India, the United States, and the United Kingdom. Let me just say that this report is really timely, with research being undertaken between 2019 and 2020 in the wake of the global COVID-19 pandemic, whose, of course, containment measures reduced our physical interaction and enhanced our online lives in every aspect. With progress being made towards universal internet connectivity and usage, governments around the world, including Kenya, are increasingly acknowledging the serious threat of online sexual exploitation and abuse. And as such, governments have taken steps to introduce necessary legislation and preventive measures to addressing online sexual exploitation and abuse. Therefore, this report will go a long way to contribute to the rapidly expanding body of knowledge that is required to inform legal reforms and programs to curb online sexual exploitation and abuse. Really, a couple of things for me strike me in the report. One is the survivor-centered approach in the methodology of collecting the data. I think that was really very profound. And then, of course, the attempt to define the different forms of online sexual exploitation and abuse, the analysis of the international legal landscape in relation to addressing online sexual exploitation and abuse and the gaps. Specifically, and coming closer home, is the regional specific analysis of the laws in relation to Asea, here is being called Asea, and the gaps that needs to be addressed, especially for the country's specific context. The succinct key findings and the 8 profound recommendations, if implemented, will go a long way in ending online sexual exploitation and abuse for women and girls across the world. of the recommendation, allow me to shine a spotlight on the 5 key recommendations that touch on governments. Though also, others really are broadly around what the international community needs to do. Government is part of the international community. Specifically for us in Kenya, the report has done a very good job in doing an analysis of the legal gaps and the loopholes that provide a great starting point for legal reforms towards ending online sexual exploitation and abuse. Though I must very quickly add that this must go hand in hand with concerted efforts to end online sexual abuse, but most importantly towards implementation. So I'll look forward to this conversation and really diving into really what I think is a takeaway for the government of Kenya from the recommendation of this report. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting, some good points there. So I'd now like to open this up to a panel discussion. And I will begin by asking Debarati to expand on what she was talking about survivor experiences, and Faith picked up on it as well. And it's obviously underpins the report. Can you tell us about survivor experiences in India and how survivor support groups and other organizations can work with governments to address online sexual exploitation and abuse, please?
Thank you so much. So the first and foremost, I would like to pull the string again, in the sense that this report basically suggests that, the survivors' experience all over the world is quite the same. Unfortunately, many of the countries in the world, they are not parties, or neither I'm not aware basically whether there is any specific treaty whereby such kinds of cyber crimes related cases, especially for women, can be looked after by countries family of nations as a whole, like what we can do for cyber crimes against children if we see the protocols, especially for the the UN protocols, etc. Resultant, if a woman becomes a victim of cybercrime, and especially image-based cybercrime, or for example even speech crime-related cybercrimes, which includes adult bullying, especially gender bullying, trolling, etc., and also defamation, what we get to see is that not only in India but also perpetrators living in different countries, they basically enjoy the sadistically enjoy the victimization of the women, be from wherever she is. Specifically, I'm talking about India, sitting in different parts of the world. I think this has been very well highlighted in the report, but at the same time, what I would like to also mention, India specifically, is that during our pandemic time, as I just mentioned, that we had seen that educators, female educators, journalists, or for example, homemakers, etc., we had all taken to internet. Especially, I would like to also mention that many women from India had turned into a good YouTuber. And resultant, they had also been trolled, they had been financially targeted, and also the defamatory statements, defamatory posts, etc., they are still on the cyberspace. Unfortunately, because of the lack of the treaty, unfortunately, because of the proper implementation, lack of proper implementation of the laws, these kinds of posts, these kinds of contents are still available on the cyberspace. So as we do understand that even though the actual victimization, the primary victimization has ended, the secondary victimization or even the traumatization still exists, and it is existing. Unfortunately, I have seen that if it is a child victim, especially if it is a female child victim, she had been probably taken care of, because our courts are, especially in India, are very vigilant on these things. Our police is also working day and night. Unfortunately, when it comes to adult women, because of certain policies from the social media companies or even the tech companies, especially certain kinds of policies which say that if a woman uploads certain contents herself, including certain semi-nude pictures also, it is completely dependent on the women, because it comes from the woman. You knew that you are going to suffer. So after that also you have uploaded, and therefore these web companies basically just withdrawn their responsibility from helping the women. So what happens if somebody goes on for clicking, reporting buttons, etc., they may get justice, but it is completely delayed. This basically increases the traumatization, suffering, etc. for the women. We have seen that here in India, and also I think most of the Asian countries and also African countries, all over the world basically, but in India specifically, I'm telling, data mining has been done and is being done by the employers for like recruiting people, including women. So when these contents actually come up, it becomes very difficult for the women to basically prove that yes, they have gone for reporting the criminal activities, but it has not been removed. Now, coming to the question of how they have felt when they have gone to the police stations, I mean, even though the number is very less, as you can get to see in the reports also, unfortunately, as I mentioned, that the police people, even though they are trained, but since these things are also being reported from the interior, places like villages or, for example, semi-urban places also, the police may not have the proper infrastructure to help
Debarati, sorry, I think we're going to come on to police for the second question. So just very briefly, are you able to say anything about how survivor support groups and other organizations can work with governments to address online sexual exploitation? Yes. And just really brief, please, because we need to get to the other panelists.
Yes. Our government, especially Indian government, is expanding their wings to include the supporters, like, the survivor supporters groups. And they're also getting some feedback, some kinds of policy guideline feedbacks, and they are making some policies. So that's the positive part. However, we are also strengthening our groups. However, we are making ourselves stronger to make our voices be heard, by the government. That is something which is really happening in a very positive note.
Okay, that sounds actually quite encouraging. So nice to hear that. Turning to Heather, let's turn to Faith in Kenya. What steps is the Kenyan government taking to tackle online sexual exploitation and abuse?
Thank you very much. Let me just say that, as I said earlier, that the government of Kenya is committed to end all forms of gender-based violence. Obviously, online sexual exploitation and abuse included. As such, the government has put in place a robust legislative framework to curb online sexual exploitation and abuse. Obviously, the gaps notwithstanding, and the report does a good job in highlighting the gaps of the comprehensive legal framework that we have. Just to mention but a few, we have the Children Act of 2010, the Computer Misuse and Cybercrimes Act of 2018, the Copyright Act of 2001, the Counter Trafficking in Persons Act, the Data Protection Act of 2019, the Employment Act, the Mutual Legal Assistance Act, the Penal Code, and the Sexual Offences Act, just to mention but a few. It's also worthwhile to mention that Kenya is also a signatory and a party to international and regional instruments that touch on online sexual exploitation and abuse. And as I say, the report does a brilliant analysis of the mapping, and I would encourage all of us to read the report. Evidently, there are gaps in the existing law to address Asea, allow me to call it that. That need to be addressed either through specific laws or integrated within the existing legal regime. And I must mention that I'm very aware of the different schools of thoughts around this area. From a practitioner's and a policy maker perspective, I would just advocate, let's just make the law work. Obviously, there are those who opine that we should have standalone laws, specifically addressing online sexual exploitation and abuse, or integrate. On the other hand, those who opine that we should integrate in the existing legal reform. In Kenya, we have in place 2 national policies which touch on the online sexual exploitation and abuse, specifically for children. And these are the National Plan for Action Against Sexual Exploitation of Children in Kenya, and the National Information Communication and Technology Policy. In addition to the legal and policy framework, Kenya has put in place institutional framework to deal with cybercrimes generally, but obviously, if you understand our terrain, then there's a lot of emphasis on protection of children online. This includes most recently, that is in November 2021, the government launched the National Computer and Cybercrime Coordination Committee, the NCCCC, as part of its wider efforts to combat the rising cybercrime across the globe. And this body or committee is tasked with consolidating action on the detection, investigation, and prosecution of cybercrimes broadly. Obviously, through the Communication Authority of Kenya, the government has established a national computer instant response team that provides information and assistance, implementing proactive measures to reduce risks of computer security instances, as well as responding to instances when they occur. There exists a national technical working group on child line protection, which brings together mandated government agencies, civil society organizations, industry representatives, the UN agencies, towards working in a concerted effort towards preventing online, actually basically broadly cybercrime. The government agency have also conducted various awareness raising and training initiatives, albeit, and I'm very aware of that, they are limited in the reach. There exists cyber centers to increase investigations of cases involving online child exploitation, and the centers receive intelligence information related to child exploitation and trafficking and refer the information to relevant officers for action. The Directorate of Criminal Investigation in Kenya, in collaboration with the Department for Children's Services and the Communication Authority of Kenya and other partners really, have established a child online protection system to protect Kenyan children against online child abuse. Further, the government has established the Anti-Human Trafficking and Child Protection Unit under DCI, that is the Directorate of Criminal Investigation, first in Kenya and more recently in Mombasa. And the unit investigates cases which are responded to in various ways and referred to regular police stations. There are working arrangements between the Kenyan law enforcement agents and companies, tech companies like Facebook, Google, for obtaining information during investigation. And we appreciate the several international organizations, including UNODC, that have supported Kenya with mentorship training and equipment in areas related to online sexual exploitation and abuse. As I said, it's not enough. So looking ahead, the government will continue to strengthen monitoring and analyzing the root causes of online sexual exploitation and abuse in order to take relevant action to the best way in terms of addressing and mitigating its impact. Working collaboratively with other agencies, as I said, the government will explore legal reforms and implementation to address measures to curb online sexual exploitation and abuse. And as I said, this report provides a good background, a good starting point for the initiative to explore legal reforms towards addressing the lacuna in legal reforms. We will continue to adapt and deliver national scale awareness and education programs about sexual exploitation and abuse, including how technology might play a role. Enhancing capacity of law enforcement agents and the justice and social support system to adequately create awareness and also enhance the capacity and resources to respond to online sexual exploitation and abuse. Ultimately, the government is committed to review and update legislation and policies to fully protect vulnerable population from online sexual exploitation and abuse, strengthen our national capacity to address Asea, and collaborate with other stakeholders, including civil society organizations and the digital service providers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that overview. That's great. And I'll probably come back to you myself with a few questions. Sounds like you're doing quite a lot. So turning to Heather and broadening it out a little bit, what are the key priorities for the international community in safeguarding women and girls from online sexual exploitation?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, Emma. And Dr. Helder and Faith nicely laid out the way forward on public-private partnership for interventions, in addition to victim-centered and trauma-informed interventions. I think the key priority for me, having worked with children internationally and domestically who have been trafficked and exploited prior to my time in the federal government when I was working in the nonprofit side, I think a key priority is prevention education for children, youth, parents, and caregivers. Through my work with survivors of exploitation, they have shared with me that the prevention skills to recognize the signs of grooming online could have served as red flag indicators and an early warning, that the signs would have made, if they had known that information ahead of time, it would have made a difference in their exploitation situation. I also just would want to quickly note, while the focus of this report is on women and girls, I would be remiss not to mention that we know that boys and transgender youth are also sexually exploited online. And in my previous work, we cared for many kiddos who were both boys and girls and transgendered youth. We know that boys are lured and groomed through gaming systems and online platforms. And it is thought that because the sexual exploitation of boys is somewhat of a taboo topic, we don't receive as many tips or disclosures from boys or transgender youth. But as a society, I think we need to consider ways to provide a safe space for boys to disclose. Apart from that, I will underscore that I think that if we really want to make a dent in stopping online exploitation, we do need to go upstream with prevention programming for children and youth at a younger age, because we know that children are being reached by predators at a younger age. And also couple that with equipping parents and caregivers with the knowledge to deal with online safety for their children and youth. Here in the United States, we're very fortunate that law enforcement takes these cases very seriously. I have collaborated with law enforcement outlining the concerns related to online exploitation and referred the various free resources that exist, and happy to share those with the audience offline. They may be interested in learning more about that. But really, we didn't want to stop there with just awareness raising and giving materials. I think our aim really is to empower and equip our audience with the resources to acquire critical knowledge and skill building to prevent abuse. I've worked on passing prevention education policy laws here in the United States and worked with NGOs that are implementing programs in Africa, Southeast Asia, and the UK. And I've learned that safeguarding children is a whole of society obligation, and it takes a whole of society response. For example, 2 years ago, while I was in the US government, we worked with tech companies to issue a series of public service announcements about the risks associated online with online exploitation during COVID-19 that were geared specifically towards caregivers and children. I also think that the set of voluntary principles that the US government developed with tech companies is a good start. We can't finish there. I would love to see more collaboration, because after working on this issue from multiple facets and angles now, I know that we must work together through public-private partnership with tech companies to raise awareness and promote prevention programming globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much. At this stage, I wondered if any of the panelists would like to pick up on anything that anyone else has said. Otherwise, I'll throw in a few questions. Do say now if there's anything you want to pick up from what the other speakers have outlined. Yes, Paige.
If I can, I just wanted to quickly pick up on a couple of the points that were made. So as I said earlier, I work for the Office of the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Opinion and Expression. And so for us, there's an inherent tension that must be at least recognized with all of this work in terms of the potential for restricting expression. And so I think my role on this panel is perhaps just to bring that out so that we can discuss it fully. Because on the one hand, what we're talking about is a very wide range of content. And what we're talking about when it happens online is also that it is happening on a number of different types of platforms. So we've talked about gaming systems, we've talked about public social media, there's also private messaging systems. And in each of those cases, the responses will need to be slightly different. And the issues that are raised are also a bit different. But at its heart, what we're talking about is protecting people, in this case, women and girls, as well as young boys and transgender or sexual minority individuals from potential online harms that are created because they are targeted on the basis typically of their gender. And on the one hand, the content must, under international standards, what we're talking about is that it must match, or it must meet the internationally set test for restrictions on freedom of expression. And then on the other hand, we also have restrictions under national law. The platforms as well set their own policies and so their own terms of service. And there have been a number of interesting initiatives to try to protect individuals by giving them user control. the issue of user control is one that will come up again and again. What are we talking about? It's essentially allowing individuals, users, to flag issues as they're coming up for it to be dealt with by the platform. Because when we rely on, for example, automatic or algorithmic content moderation, in the case of public platforms, there's a risk of over censoring of content. Another risk that often comes up as well is censoring at the point of upload. So if we are blocking or filtering content when it's uploaded, there is a risk that content may be inappropriately censored. Another issue is about transparency and accountability. So to ensure that platforms are providing an outline, providing information to the public about the content that is restricted, and to allow the public to both see visibly what content is being restricted, as well as to have mechanisms in place to appeal it where necessary. The end result then is to allow for a safer online space while still allowing individuals to post content to the maximum extent possible, while addressing some of the issues that we've been talking about so far. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Paige, and I apologize because I was meant to ask you the question, but you answered it very eloquently anyway, about how to balance tensions between preserving freedom of expression online and protecting against online harm. I wanted to come back to Faith and just ask her, you've outlined a whole multiplicity of policies and institutions dealing with Asea and offences. Does this create some confusion? Does it help or does it impede prosecutions?
Thank you for the question. You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, very well. I'm not sure I have the right or wrong answer for that, but just to say, I think, and back to the report, which is the subject of our conversation today, that of all the countries of focus in this report, that there is no law comprehensively that addresses Asea. Yeah, just to start. Okay, before we talk about the multiplicity of the laws. But we have different, a fragmentation of different pieces of legislation and policies that address the different forms of Asea instead. And for me, I think the priority would be, I wouldn't be for or against different laws that are addressing that. I think the matter here is to ensure that we are comprehensively addressing all forms of online sexual exploitation and abuse. And I know different countries have different kind of legal regimes, but for me, I would say that it's really up to the conversation that can happen at national level, probably at the justice system, working collaboratively with other stakeholders, just to have this conversation in terms of would it be better to have comprehensively a single law that addresses online sexual exploitation and abuse, or various laws that address that. But let me also very quickly add that the multidimensional nature of online sexual exploitation and abuse obviously then calls for a comprehensive and a multidimensional approach towards addressing this problem.
Okay, thank you very much, Faith. Does anyone want to pick up on anything that's been said, or shall I move on to the second round of questions and then there'll be time for debate at the end as well? Yes, Deborah.
I'm getting to see some questions in the question answer this tab. That's why, and also following Faith and also Paige and Heather. I think that we have laws, but we need to have a better legal education, especially for cyber law and also for gender related, like online gender related, gender crime related issues. And as I do get to see here that one participant is asking about burden of proof. I think that all universities all across the world must have proper channels to teach the students, that is the budding lawyers, to how to handle these kinds of cybercrime cases. We do get to see that there are very good defense lawyers, but when it comes to the prosecution or when it comes to the victim support, unfortunately, we also get to see that there is lack of awareness, knowledge amongst the students, especially those who are working as pro bono or those who are working as ambassadors for some kind of NGOs, etc. So I think that the universities all across the world, colleges, law colleges all across the world, they should think of getting better legal education, especially for making the students understand what is cybercrimes against women, what are the laws that would be applicable, especially from the victimological perspective and also from the website liabilities. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That's really helpful. Sorry, I'm just keeping an eye on some of the questions coming in. Deborati, just coming back to you, can you please talk a little bit more about the police? We've heard that the police often don't take this seriously, or they're not trained, and especially not trained in cybercrime. Can you expand on the issues and challenges there, please, for me?
In most of the cases, we do get to see that the criminal procedural laws and also the penal codes, that means in India, and also I would like to speak for Pakistan and Bangladesh, because we had been, the same country which had been under the British colonial laws. So we have got quite the similar penal code and also criminal procedural laws. That's why I'm telling, because I do get cases from these countries also. What happens is that there had been some offenses which have been reduced to the offense of nature of the petty offenses. And you can understand from the colonial understanding and then to the real life crimes and then coming to the digital crimes, there are certain offenses, the punishment for which has been indicated as very less. That is the reason the police has got the discrimination, the police has got the discretion to understand, or the police has got the independence to understand that whether they would be taking the cognizance of the cases or they would be just making the case go just like that. That means after initial, some kind of mediation, they just let go the cases. Unfortunately, such kinds of cases form a bigger aspect. Say, for example, if it is gender bullying, if it is defamation on the cyberspace or trolling, etc., the police may not accept such cases as a heavy offense, because in our, if you say from the Indian penal code side, we have got lesser punishment for such offenses until and unless it is getting connected with some heavy offenses. Say, for example, if it is graver sexual abuse, exploitation, penetrative sexual exploitation, or non-penetrative, like aggravated penetrative sexual exploitation or aggravated sexual exploitation on women, which means that the content basically comes up with text and the videos or the images, which will be showing that yes, a woman is being exploited on the cyberspace, because physically also she is undergoing some pain on the cyberspace. That entire content is being now made viral or being shown, so that her pain will be escalating. And those who are watching it, they might or might not like to see those contents, because especially as Heather was telling, that child sexual exploitation also in our country, and I understand that if you see from the Beijing rule or from the this child right convention, we do get to see that if the child is made to watch these kinds of contents, then it may have a very adverse impact on their mindset, especially if the adults are being exploited and that is being shown to children who are below the age of 18. So in such cases, we do get to see that the police may not register the cases. And then thereafter, what happens? Once the victim goes to the police and the victim sees that the police is not able to help them, they will go back to some other people who may be amateur hackers, or who may be not properly trained to handle such cases. So it will be escalating, and thereafter it is the victim who has to remain a victim forever. Unfortunately, in India, such types of incidences are rising. But at the same time, our National Commission for Women, we have a National Commission for Women, We have got National Commission for Protection of Child Rights also. They are, as I said earlier also, they are expanding the wings to include people like us, professors, NGO persons, etc., to invite our opinion and to build some policies. So there is a positive point, but unfortunately there is a negative point also, because these stakeholders, they may not come down to the ground level to see that which police officers are actually rejecting, which police stations or officers are actually accepting, and how the counseling mechanism from the police, or for example the police investigations, etc., are taking place. By the time it comes back to the court and the victim comes back to the court to say that I'm not happy with the police, the sufferings, traumatizing, etc., grows more than what actually it started with. So this is something which is a very pathetic condition. I think it's not only the case from India, but all over the world this is happening.
Yes, I was just about to say, it sounds horribly familiar, and I suspect Faith and Heather could also provide similar stories. And just turning to Paige, can you please talk a bit about what tech companies can do outside of continuing to improve technologies? Are there any examples of policies, tools, or practices that companies have put in place which have been effective in curbing these sorts of abuses and harms?
When we talk about harmful online content, what we often end up talking about is really limited to sort of the dominant public-facing platforms like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and now increasingly TikTok. First of all, I think we need to expand the conversation to also talk about what's happening on the private messaging platforms, and also some of the smaller platforms, because the dominant platforms are increasingly making at least public commitments to adhere to, well, international human rights law as a starting point, and they're also signing on to an increasing number of commitments. So for example, in June of last year, Facebook, Google, TikTok, and Twitter committed to tackling online abuse and putting some tools in place for the safety of women on their platforms. So there are definitely sectoral initiatives that are being put in place with the participation as well of civil society partners who can give them input on terms of practical implementation, because often it's not the commitment that's most important, right? It's the implementation and how to actually ensure that those commitments are followed through in a way that promotes the voice of women, girls, and the users that are most at risk on platforms. So those safety tools are an important part of it. As I mentioned earlier, there's also the issue around transparency and accountability. There have been, so one of the issues is that sometimes we see numbers put forward in terms of the quantity of content taken down or the percentage of content taken down. And it's difficult to know exactly what that means in terms of whether that content should in fact be taken down. And so in providing really transparency both to individual users as well as at a broader level to stakeholders like NGOs, journalists, and others who are able to sort of probe into it and provide some feedback about how that's working is really important. And again, those appeal mechanisms are key. And then finally, if I could just highlight the need for promoting as well a broader range of platforms, because one of the issues that we have is that we rely on the dominant platforms and the tools that they developed. And if there was greater diversity within the space, there are some very interesting initiatives to put forward alternative forms of content moderation on social media that would give, again, users more control. Women and girls could create safe spaces for themselves and decide what content they wish to see. And that might mean something different than what we're currently seeing on social media. Of course, that's not the only issue, but that could be part of the solution. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Paige, and really interesting the focus on smaller private messaging platforms and other platforms, not just the giants that we always hear about. Heather, coming back to you, and I'm sorry we are running out of time a little bit, so please keep comments brief. In what ways can laws and policies on sexual exploitation be strengthened to adapt to the digital space, also taking into account that online exploitation often occurs across multiple jurisdictions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much, Emma. And also I might kind of weave in some comments related to questions that were asked earlier or raised. As noted earlier, because perpetrators exploit online, this crime can be facilitated across any border and often is, which is why we work so closely with federal law enforcement that have a global footprint. While I was at the US State Department, we tackled this problem related to children through funding child protection compacts. That partnership with the Philippines in particular made significant strides to counter the online abuse of children. And in those particular cases, offenders were not just viewing the live streaming of abuse, they were then also making a trip overseas to abuse children in person, which is an example of where we see the nexus of online sexual exploitation and abuse and human trafficking. To counter perpetrators, cross-border collaboration with law enforcement, prosecutors, governments, non-government organizations, and the international organizations should work together to strengthen our online safety laws, policy, the detection of online exploitation. And the role of the technology companies and platforms is important to address as well. My first recommendation is protection by default or safety by design. How easy would it be for phones, computers, and gaming devices to inherently protect children and women and their rights in the factory settings? Adults could easily change their settings after they purchase a new device or gaming system to be less restrictive, but at least then the littlest kiddos who don't know how to change those settings would be protected. My second recommendation is that we need robust trust and safety programs. They're critical. I think tech companies could set up these efforts. I see them go to great lengths on social media platforms to counter disinformation. We now know they have those capabilities to monitor at a very granular level, something before they told me was not possible. So I'm hoping that they'll take these capabilities and adapt them for detecting online sexual exploitation and abuse materials. I also say, because encryption is such a challenge, I think we really need the financial services industry to step up. I think they have a part to play in fighting online sexual exploitation. When we think about human rights work, we most often think of social workers, law enforcement, healthcare providers as being on the front lines of combating crimes such as human trafficking and online sexual exploitation. But the reality is, if we want to really end online sexual exploitation, I think we need to follow the money back to the perpetrator. The scale of this problem is too large to solve alone with law enforcement. And sometimes, despite our best efforts, the only way we can detect and thwart perpetrators is by following the money back to the offender. And certainly that's true with cryptocurrency payments. And that means we need forensic accountants, analysts, and others to lend us their expertise, because we can't do this work alone or in silos. And we will not arrest our way out of this problem. We must have the financial, institutions involved to make real progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, Faith, I just want to ask you about Equality's Now recommendation that we need international standards that will provide a framework for national laws and policies, because we've heard that existing laws simply aren't keeping pace. What role can the Kenyan government take to move things forward at the international level? And again, sorry to keep repeating myself, but please be concise, because we want to give the audience time to ask a few questions too. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. First, I just want to reiterate that we welcome the recommendations in the report of international legal standards to provide a framework for national laws and policies. And just to say that there exist many opportunities and platforms that this can be taken forward, not just with the Kenyan government, but also with other governments. Specifically to the Kenyan government, let me just highlight two opportunities. And I see a question really around the African Union. I do think that there is, with the increasing acknowledgement of governments around the importance of safe internet use, there is an opportunity within the African Union to see how best we can take this forward, and especially some of the recommendations. But most importantly is, some of you might be aware that the government of Kenya is co-leading the Generation Equality Action Coalition on Gender-Based Violence. globally. And therein, as the government, we have made 12 core commitments really around addressing gender-based violence. And I think there's an opportunity in there to scale this up and to bring this conversation, especially the recommendations on international legal standards, to these spaces so that we can explore the possibilities of moving towards international standards around online sexual exploitation and abuse. I think I'll just stop there, but just in closing, just to say that I think tech companies can do more. I don't know who, one of the panelists alluded that we really have seen tech companies recently, especially within the COVID-19 pandemic response, focusing really on the whole question of checking disinformation. And I think this can also be done, just to curb online sexual exploitation and abuse. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for picking up on the tech question, because I was going to ask you about that. So we now come to the Q&A part of the discussion, but before we do, I just want to know if any of the panelists want to pick up on what their fellow speakers said in the last 15 minutes or so with the latest round of questions. Does anyone want to jump in? If not, I've got a few questions. Okay, so thank you very much to our speakers, who I think have been keeping an eye on the Q&A function and answering questions as we went along. I've got one of my own. Last year I interviewed a woman, a very young, bright, professional woman, and she had been groomed online for 2 years and then eventually went to meet who she thought was a sort of online buddy in real life, and ended up being kidnapped and trafficked for sex. It was a really horrific story. And one thing she told me that really stuck with me was that the COVID pandemic had created this playground for predators. And I wondered if perhaps some of you could just elaborate a little bit more on how COVID has amplified these harms and any lessons you've learned or your governments have learned from the pandemic and the way it's amplified these horrific crimes. Deborati, do you want to take that one first, and then other people can jump in? Okay.
It is very unfortunate that in India also we did get to see such kinds of things. Due to COVID pandemic, all of us, as I mentioned, that we were all, locked up in our houses. I use the term locked up because even when such kinds of victims, as you were mentioning, we did have these case laws, also case studies, examples also, when they tried to approach the police. Obviously because they were groomed and there was issues of sextortion. I'm sorry, I will use the term sextortion, even though equality now has shown another term which is very much holistic. When the victim wanted to approach the police in such cases, the victims especially wanted to approach the police, they were told that because of the COVID pandemic, they could not operate properly because this would need a robust infrastructure. This would also need a cross-jurisdiction, evidence gathering, etc. So these kinds of things basically were stalled. And I know cases where these things are still stalled because of the lockdown and related issues. Obviously, there were also targeted, gender targeting, where the women especially have approached the police through online platforms. But again, arrest rates are very, very low. And again, the investigation rates are even more low. And as you can understand that the trials are very, very, it's almost nil. So obviously our governments, especially in India, we are trying our level best to expand and also to make it stronger, our platforms to make it stronger, to go ahead for collecting the cyber forensic related, evidences, etc., and to check these things. But unfortunately, again, for the lockdown, everything has slowed down. So it is a very unfortunate fact that victims have been suffering. There is a traumatization because this lockdown related issues, which did not allow the police to go ahead for proper investigation, etc., and also for the trial courts to get the proper witnesses, and also to get the proper court related matters run smoothly. Because now that when we are talking about, we are again having this virtual court hearing, and this has again stalled several of investigations as such, even today's date also.
Thank you very much. Faith or Heather or Paige, do you want to comment on the COVID question?
Yeah, I might take a stab at that one. I'll speak from the US perspective, perhaps, if that's okay. Mm-hmm. So here we had children, for the most part, digitally learning. And so for the first time, families and caregivers who previously had restrictions around access to devices, how much screen time children were having, all of that kind of just went out the window during the pandemic. We had this just kind of course collision of a constellation of effects happening where parents and caregivers were working from home, right? And trying to get children just to do their schoolwork and kind of leave them alone so they could be present on their computers as they were trying to work. And then you have children who have access to devices. And I don't think that we prepared young people or adults properly for digital citizenship, right? Like, I think, we just kind of got thrown into this sphere and opened this new paradigm where we had more children accessible than ever before. And then we had vulnerable women. And I think a lot of times we talk about vulnerable populations and we forget that one of the things that variables that make people vulnerable to this is emotional, right? Certainly we do see victims and survivors who were without status, they didn't have placement, someone extended what they thought was a kind hand to them. And we see those cases where there's a socioeconomic consideration. But some of the most horrific cases of online sexual exploitation that I've ever been a party to involve very wealthy people whose 9-year-old daughter thought she was talking to somebody on Instagram who presented as like a 13 or 15-year-old boy and lured and groomed them. And you see sort of like this bonding that happens between the online perpetrator and the victim. And then there's, in the domestic violence realm, we see the power and control wheel. Well, that's the same exact thing that happens. We see that shift, that wheel flips, and all of a sudden that person goes from what they think is a healthy relationship to then having something leveraged against them. And sometimes that's images, sometimes it's videos, and they make threats to young people or women, and they threaten to ruin their reputation. They threaten to tell somebody in authority. They tell them law enforcement won't believe them or be on their side. And I think there's this, kind of dynamic that is important for consideration when we're talking about online sexual abuse and the tactics, because I will say there are literally handbooks for perpetrators on how to do this and how to lure and groom somebody. And I think it's just atrocious. I think it's something we're not tackling. And I think the way to counter it really is by getting awareness out there, but then also prevention skills so that people aren't caught unaware, that they know that there's a chance that this could happen to themselves or a loved one. And I will just say, lastly, it could happen to anyone. Those of us who have been in this field long enough, I think we are continually surprised at the tactics that people come up with to exploit others. And so the more that we can raise awareness and not think, well, this only happens to this vulnerable population, but recognize it could happen to your neighbor next door. And I certainly have seen those types of cases where well-to-do families have come to me and said, Heather, how did this happen? Because we come from privilege. And again, I just can't stress it enough how important it is for us to get all these tools and resources out to everyone, not just to vulnerable, what we consider traditional classic vulnerable populations.
Thank you very much, Heather. I think the sort of message for better education is coming across loud and clear, as well as better laws. We've now run out of time, I'm afraid. I know we haven't answered all your questions, and I'm really sorry about that. It's been absolutely fascinating debate, but I am now going to hand over wrap up the Q&A section and hand over to Tsitsi Matakeri to wrap things up. Tsitsi is Equality Now's global lead on ending sexual exploitation, and she will give us some final thoughts today. Tsitsi, over to you.
Thank you, Emma. At Equality Now, we know from our experience that to deal with complexity, we have to address it from a wide range of perspectives, that we need to take an ecosystems approach and to engage with as many actors as possible so that we can understand the various nuanced factors that are at play. So as we seek to address online sexual exploitation and abuse through the law, we need to engage in a range of issues, for instance, in debates around privacy, freedoms, rights, and safety, in understanding vulnerability and routes into exploitation, looking at factors such as poverty, sexism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, adolescence, and other factors of inequality, as well as the lack of internet awareness. We also need to engage in unraveling legal arguments around issues of consent and coercion, as well as in understanding offenders' behaviors in the digital space and beyond. We also know that we need to engage with national and international human rights and criminal justice systems in order to identify and address gender biases within their structures, processes, and patterns of behavior. This is definitely not an easy task because none of these areas of intervention are discrete. I think as we've already heard so expertly from our speakers today, these issues impact on each other, they intersect and they intertwine. So we know that we need to bring minds together to help us and to help each other, survivors of online abuse, experts in gender, human rights and the law, advisors from governments and regional and international bodies, as well as tech companies, tech for good, the media, and activists and equality champions from across the world. And today we've heard from some of these experts and actors who are working on these issues. And we hope that you are inspired as we are to want to know more, to learn more, and to do more. And as Equality Now, we are looking to continue these conversations at both the international and national levels, starting off from the countries that were part of our research and working together with a diversity of actors to identify solutions within the different contexts. And we invite you to join us to end online sexual exploitation and abuse. If you're interested in joint advocacy, in partnership working, in building or being part of a movement or funding this work, or any other creative ideas for collaboration, please do reach out. Would be extremely delighted to hear from you. And also just to thank you for taking the time to be with us today. Thanks, Emma.
Thank you very much, Tsitsi. Just one thing I wanted to highlight before we close. This report drew from legal research facilitated by Trust Law, the Thomson Reuters Foundation's global legal pro bono service. And if you want to know more about the pro bono service, do go to the Thomson Reuters Foundation website. It's now my pleasure on behalf of Equality Now and the Thomson Reuters Foundation to close this event. As we mentioned at the start, we'll be sharing a recording of the event with attendees, and we'd also encourage you to go to Equality Now's website where you can find the full report along with interviews and fact sheets. I would like to thank all our panelists for their insights, Dr. Deborah Halder, Paige Morrow, Heather Fisher, and Faith Kasiva. It's been a really interesting debate and I've learned lots. I'm sure our audience has too. And thank you, of course, to everyone who has joined us. Thank you again and goodbye.
Thank you.